This is Latter-day Presentations, where we discuss topics and issues of faith for Latter-day Saints. Welcome back to our presentation on the authorship of Isaiah for Latter-day Saints. This is part 7, and we're going to talk about questions around intertextuality and Qumran. So let's dive in. Intertextual borrowing is a very common question in studies of biblical texts. Why do texts seem related to each other? Why do they have such similar features? Some scholars see sections of Isaiah as borrowing from or alluding to later prophetic works, and they use that idea as justification for the multiple author theory. Now, here's an example of early Isaianic intertextuality. We have Isaiah 2 and Micah 4. And when you look at these passages, you can see they correspond very, very strongly. And scholars have engaged in a lot of debate around the similarities between these two passages. Some scholars think that Isaiah borrowed from Micah or vice versa, and a lot of scholars think that Isaiah and Micah are borrowing from a different text that we do not have access to. Now, I'll say for Latter-day Saints, if you're not familiar with this aspects of biblical texts, it might be kind of a shock to see these relationships between texts. And it might challenge some of our presuppositions about how revelation works and whether it always needs to be original. I wrote an article at Nauvoo Neighbor that addresses this question in depth of how revelation works and whether or not it needs to be original to be revelation. Here's a passage from Joseph Blankensop's Isaiah commentary. And he's talking about the correspondence between 2 Kings 18:20 and Isaiah 36 through 39. And here he gives a little bit of a summary over the scholarly debate as to which passage drew upon which passage, or did they have another history that they drew upon. And he concludes towards the end, he says, it's fairly clear then that whoever put these stories together was acquainted with a compilation of sayings attributed to Isaiah in whatever form they circulated. So again, these passages, 2 Kings 18 through 20 and Isaiah 36-39, they contain a lot of similarities. And this is yet another example of where scholars can't really figure out definitively how these similarities came about, whether these two were borrowing from each other in one direction or another, or whether they had another source text. Now let's talk about Jeremiah's intertextual borrowing, because it's very, very important when we talk about Isaiah and intertextuality. Here you have a snapshot of William Holliday's commentary on Jeremiah, and you can see in this appendix, he lists a ton of instances where Jeremiah was dependent on other texts, where he drew upon other biblical texts in his prophetic sayings. And the Jewish Study Bible says Jeremiah is steeped in prophetic traditions. Again, he's bathing and soaking in prophetic traditions, absorbing them. He is familiar with the genre of visions, symbolic actions, and oracles against the nations, and various other prophetic genres. This is an extensive list of dependents. Jeremiah is like a prophetic sponge. He soaks up a lot of different narratives and genres and styles and teachings from other biblical texts. Now here is Richard Schultz. He wrote a book called The Search for Quotation, Verbal Parallels in the Prophets. And his book is based on his PhD dissertation at Yale under Brevard Childs, who is an Isaiah scholar. Here Schultz is talking about how scholars have gone about accounting for intertextuality in the Bible. And in his book, Schultz does a really in-depth review of the history of all of these scholarly debates. He says which question was most prominent in a particular discussion and how thoroughly it was treated depended on the scholar's primary concern. For example, Kaspari focused on the direction of the borrowing. Whether or not borrowing had occurred did not receive much discussion. Miller was interested in weeding out passages incorrectly identified as quotations, but also in explaining the origin of the verbal parallels. Paul simply assumed that all of the parallels he identified were examples of second Isaiah borrowing from Jeremiah. Each scholar utilized some type of criterion, whether explicit or implicit, to determine the answer to these questions. Even those who were accused of offering ad hoc arguments on a passage-by-passage basis had some criteria in mind. Some considered a passage to be a quotation simply because it was included in another scholar's list. The direction of borrowing usually was determined on the a priori basis of the prevailing scholarly consensus regarding literary chronology, rather than as a result of a passage-by-passage comparison. To summarize, scholars who studied verbal parallels in the prophets had little in common in terms of motivation, presuppositions, or approach. A common theme throughout this presentation is that scholars have choices available to them, they have personal agendas, they have biases, they have commitments that they bring to their work. And this discussion of how they approach intertextuality illustrates this very, very well. And now let's turn to focus a little more in depth on Jeremiah's borrowing from Isaiah. And we can have a little glance here at William Holiday's common passages between Jeremiah and Isaiah. You can see there's a lot of material here. You can see that Jeremiah was very, very heavily influenced by the sayings of Isaiah. Here's something interesting from Richard Schultz, and he's responding to evangelical scholar Kenton Sparks, who holds to the multiple author hypothesis for Isaiah. He says, according to Sparks, the fact that Jeremiah never cites the prophecies of Isaiah 40 through 55 regarding the Babylonian exile and subsequent deliverance through Cyrus also suggests that Jeremiah's copy of the book of Isaiah did not yet contain these chapters, and thus that they must not have been authored in the 8th century. Yet the argument from silence is tenuous. Scholars have still not offered a satisfying explanation for the surprising observation that King Josiah is never directly addressed or spoken about in the book of Jeremiah. Nor do we know why contemporary prophets such as Hosea, Amos, Isaiah, and Micah never refer to each other, although there are some indications of the mutual influence of their messages. As for the speculative claim that Jeremiah's copy of the book of Isaiah did not contain Isaiah 40 through 55, one must note that there have been extensive studies of the relationship between Jeremiah and 2nd Isaiah by scholars such as Werner Tanner, Shalom Paul, Patricia Tull, and Benjamin Summer. Although these scholars uniformly conclude that Deutero-Isaiah is borrowing from Jeremiah and not vice versa, one gets the impression that they had concluded that Jeremiah preceded Deutero-Isaiah on the basis of historical critical consensus, prior to undertaking their detailed analyses and comparisons. They do not offer any compelling evidence from the examined verbal parallels and allusions that these examples could not have resulted instead from Jeremiah's borrowing from the book of Isaiah. Now, Sparks's argument asserts that Jeremiah's non-use of the Cyrus passages is evidence that they did not yet exist. But that is problematic for several reasons. Number one, we don't know what portions of the book of Isaiah were included in the book in Jeremiah's time, versus which portions may have remained sealed until later. We read in the Book of Mormon that the brass plates were kept under guard, not allowed to be copied, and that they had some amount of Isaiah and probably not all of it as we now have it. Jeremiah had a lot of Isaiah, and Ezekiel had some of it. They may have even had different amounts of the text, different versions. Walter Zimmerly says that Ezekiel knew Isaiah's preaching is shown by the symbolic action which has grown out of a metaphor used by Isaiah. Behind Ezekiel's call vision, Isaiah 6 may be traceable. So also the metaphor of dross. And he says that Isaiah's oracle of the day of Yahweh in Isaiah 2 may also have influenced Ezekiel is not to be excluded. This is important to understand because we know that Ezekiel was influenced by other texts. Yet there were a lot of passages of Isaiah and Jeremiah that were very, very relevant to Ezekiel's audience, and there's no rhyme or reason to his borrowing. There are massive amounts of relevant content that he could have taken from these other prophets, but just simply chose not to. Items that would have been very, very helpful to his audience and very relevant to his own teachings. So returning to Sparks's argument, it has some assumptions that we should probably unpack. Number one, that Jeremiah's sayings never included any of those references to deliverance from exile. Number two, Jeremiah had all of the text of Isaiah, right? Like I mentioned, we don't know if some amount of the text of Isaiah was sealed up even through the time of Jeremiah, or if parts of the text of Isaiah had been deposited with different groups and kind of aggregated later on after Jeremiah, it's hard to say for sure. And also, if Jeremiah had access to those prophecies, he would have included them. Well, why would we assume that? Because prophets always do that? As we've seen, that is not the case. That's a poor assumption. Or because it's what I would do. That seems to be the more accurate assumption behind the assumption here. Now let's dive a little bit deeper into specific scholarly studies of intertextuality. And this example is from Benjamin Sommer, his book, A Prophet Reads Scripture, which is based on his dissertation. And for his study, he, number one, assumed Deutero-Isaiah, and number two, he looked at the way this hypothetical Deutero-Isaiah appropriated and modified and responded to passages of other prophetic literature. And here he has an example from the book of Jeremiah. And it's this metaphor of a young woman in jewels, a bride with ornaments. And he says that Deutero-Isaiah took that passage and sort of reversed it in his own writings. Sommer thinks that this reversing behavior is something that is stylistically unique to Deutero-Isaiah. Well, let's unpack that a little bit. There are a couple of problems with this methodology. Number one is obviously the assumption of the existence of Deutero-Isaiah. And that's a problem because if you assume the existence of Deutero-Isaiah, then obviously that is going to steer and determine all of your thinking about the direction of borrowing between these texts. Another problem in this methodology is he ignores Isaiah 1 through 39. That's a problem because what if these things that he claims are unique to Deutero-Isaiah are also features that we see in Isaiah 1 through 39 and in other biblical texts? Let's look at why this is a problem. In William Lee Holliday's commentary on Jeremiah, here he talks about Jeremiah 21 verse 12, and he says, "Render each morning justice, and save him who is robbed from the hand of the oppressor." And he says, it seems to be based on Isaiah 10:2. "Woe to those who decree iniquitous decrees, to turn aside from a verdict the needy, and to rob the justice of the poor of my people." So here we have this example of intertextual borrowing between first Isaiah and the book of Jeremiah. Sommer didn't evaluate these examples in his study. Let's see an example of this problem in this quote from Joseph Blankensop in his Isaiah commentary. Blankensop says that Isaiah 5, 1 through 7 was in reality a disguised indictment of Israel becomes apparent with the appeal to Jerusalemites and Judeans to pass judgment against themselves, followed by the pronouncing of the verdict. With this last, we are in the language field familiar to Isaiah of the curse, including curses appended to treaties, like ye shall plant vineyards and not eat their fruit. Similar language, probably influenced by the vineyard song, is found in Jeremiah, and a later brief commentary on the song announces the reversal of the cursed condition. You can see a problem here. If Sommer is saying that stylistic devices like reversal of prophetic sayings are unique to Deutero-Isaiah, then it's going to be a problem if we find them in first Isaiah, corresponding with passages in Jeremiah and other places. So that decision to ignore Isaiah 1 through 39 is a gaping hole in his analysis. There's no question about it. But let's return to this more fundamental question. What is borrowing in prophetic texts anyway? Sommer envisions a very deliberative process of copying and modifying. And in Isaiah 2 and Micah 4, that may have been the case. But a more cautious conceptualization of prophetic influence is in order, like we see in Jeremiah 23 and Ezekiel 34. If you look at these two passages, Jeremiah 23 and Ezekiel 34, you can see how I've color-coded the similarities between these passages. And it's very, very clear that there are stark similarities here, right? Now, Moshe Greenberg, in his commentary on Ezekiel, he says, "The influence of Jeremiah, both in the image and in the terminology on both components of this oracle, is patent. It is plausibly accounted for by the assumption that Ezekiel had access to the words of his older Jerusalemite contemporary." He's saying that he thinks that Ezekiel borrowed this passage from Jeremiah, that he had access to Jeremiah's words. But what would that borrowing look like? Would it look like Ezekiel sitting down with a Jeremiah scroll and just copying certain passages over into his own text? There's a problem here. Let's look at how those color-coded passages are distributed across the two chapters. And you can see here, they are not distributed in a very coherent way. So I hypothesize, looking at this, that Ezekiel actually had heard these concepts from Jeremiah or read them from a Jeremiah scroll at some point in the past, and that he internalized those, and when he received inspiration to create a prophecy railing against the shepherds of the people, he experienced some recall of some of these concepts from Jeremiah and wove them into his own sayings, maybe even without him understanding that he was drawing upon things he had heard before. Now, why is this question of direction of borrowing and allusion important? Let's try to visualize what we're talking about here. Down below, you have this scholarly model that was undertaken by Benjamin Sommer and Patricia Tull. They assumed the existence of Deutero-Isaiah, and they did a study based on that assumption. And they assumed that this Deutero-Isaiah was influenced by all of these other prophets. And Deutero-Isaiah, again, is the prophetic sponge. Now, Sommer's approach requires single authorship for chapters 40 through 66. Why? Because these stylistic things that he claims are unique to Deutero-Isaiah are found all throughout the latter half of Isaiah. That goes very sharply against the scholarly consensus around authorship of the second half of Isaiah. But both of these scholars ignore the first half of Isaiah. So their refusal to address the first half of Isaiah means that they've blinded themselves to the possibility that the forms of correspondence that they articulate in their studies also apply in first Isaiah. That would be a really interesting question. But one of the problems with asking that question is it might undermine their assumption about the existence of a Deutero-Isaiah who was a prophetic sponge absorbing all of these passages from other prophets. Now, the traditional view of Isaiah is that he was a very, very influential prophet. He was called the Prince of the Prophets, as a matter of fact. So the traditional view holds that Isaiah's influence radiated out to all of these other prophets. And that's why we see Isaiah phrases in these other prophetic texts. I personally think that this is the more plausible explanation. I'm speaking from my plausibility structures and my assumptions, of course. But scholars have envisioned kind of a reversal of this traditional view, and I don't find it persuasive. Now, going back to the work of Benjamin Sommer, let's look at what Hugh Williamson says about Sommer's work. He says, "A work as stimulating as this deserves a much fuller evaluation than can be offered here. I must therefore restrict myself to just two initial reactions. In the first place, there is a danger, and Sommer is by no means alone in falling for it. That discovery of some new data may blind the critic to the force of other considerations which need to be kept alongside it. The critical conclusions which he rejects have been achieved over a long period of time and on the basis of many converging lines of evidence. It is thus unlikely, for instance, that Sommer's 9-page appendix entitled 'Was There a Trito-Isaiah?' will convince many to abandon their view that there was, indeed that there was more than one. Similarly, while the results of his work, which in this particular respect are complemented by those of the simultaneously published monograph by Patricia Tull, suggesting that Isaiah 40 through 66 relates to 139 in the same way as it does to Jeremiah, and that it was therefore an originally freestanding work whose association with Isaiah is wholly secondary, will require careful consideration. This will need to be done in the context of many other lines of evidence, to which he pays not the slightest attention. Without going into detail here, many examples could be given of instances where a less committed reader— now let's pause here and acknowledge when he says a less committed reader, he means a less biased reader. He means a reader engaging in less motivated reasoning in his studies. Again, many examples could be given of instances where a less committed reader than Summer may question whether the allusions he finds are really there at all. From the point of view of method, at least, it would have been preferable, first, if he could have started out from unambiguous cases of borrowing, and second, if he had not appealed to stylistic devices, which leave too large a space for scholarly ingenuity, to confirm the cases, but rather had explored these only once it was confirmed that there was an allusion present in the first place. As things stand, I suspect that many of his claimed allusions will be dismissed as remote at best by other commentators. Williamson's critique is pretty sharp. And again, it really is speaking to the motivated reasoning and the biases that characterize the work of these scholars who are talking about questions of intertextuality and even other questions surrounding the authorship of Isaiah. And now let's move on and talk about Qumran and the Great Isaiah Scroll. Some scholars think that a break in the Great Isaiah Scroll at Qumran hints at a division of the text or perhaps multiple authorship. It doesn't. The idea here is there's a break in the text of the Great Isaiah Scroll. And because you see this break, you can infer that the scribe is telling us, oh, the next section was created by a different author. Here is Selgi Elbiun. He says one of the most important scribal features in the Great Isaiah Scroll is a gap of about 3 or 4 lines between chapters 33 and 34, found in column 27 out of 54 columns, i.e. the midpoint of the scroll. There is no evidence in the scroll or any of the biblical texts of Isaiah at Qumran of a division between chapters 39 and 40 or between chapters 55 and 56. Remember, going back to how scholars have traditionally divided the text of Isaiah, saying there's a break between chapters 39 and 40 and another break between chapters 55 and 56. The Great Isaiah Scroll doesn't reflect those divisions at all. Here's George J. Brooke. He says most modern readers of Isaiah are educated to think of a major division in the book between chapters 39 and 40. In 1928, Charles Cutler Torrey, exceptionally among modern interpreters, proposed that Isaiah 34 through 35 belonged to 2nd Isaiah, though he did not try to explain the presence of Isaiah 36 through 39 in their present position. In the Great Isaiah Scroll, a distinct gap of at least 3 lines occurs at the bottom of column 27 at the end of a sheet of parchment that is between chapters 33 and 34. He says the overall form and structure of the book of Isaiah has been reconsidered by Jesper Hogenhaven. Failing to take account of Brownlee's insights, he attempted to use the Great Isaiah Scroll to justify the scholarly division of Isaiah at chapter 40. And then he talks about some marginal marks in the scroll. And he says, however, he failed to see that the spread of these signs might indicate that they mark the end of sections, several of which correspond with the Brownlee analysis cited above, even though Brownlee did not use the marginal marks to support his case. And now let's talk about another facet of the Qumran question, okay, and whether scrolls at Qumran can kind of shed light on questions of multiple authorship of Isaiah. Here we have some examples of texts in Qumran that contain references to passages of Isaiah that scholars have dated late. Here's one of them, Isaiah 24:17. And the passage says, Belial is unrestrained in Israel, just as God said by Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amoz. So you have a Qumran commentator here absolutely explicitly attributing that passage to Isaiah of Jerusalem. And then there's another one down below. It is written in the book of Isaiah the prophet. And then he quotes Isaiah 54. So these are not necessarily conclusive, but if you're asking the question, what did the scribes at Qumran believe about authorship of Isaiah? These are a couple of useful data points. And finally, in conclusion, neither intertextuality nor texts at Qumran provide evidence for multiple authorship of Isaiah. We can say that fairly definitively. Arguments from intertextuality are circular in nature. They assume Deutero-Isaiah And then they use Deutero-Isaiah's intertextual activity as evidence for Deutero-Isaiah. Qumran offers no evidence for multiple authorship of Isaiah, and a few points of evidence that ancient Israelites did not adhere to a view of multiple authorship. Again, as we conclude, a reminder that these slides are available for download at Nauvoo Neighbor. Feel free to download them and use them how you please. Thanks for joining me in this segment of the presentation. This has been an episode of Latter-day Presentations. We would like to remind viewers that our channel represents our own views and not necessarily any official positions of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We hope this presentation has been informative. Our notes for this show are at Nauvoo Neighbor, and the link can be found in the show description. Also in the show description, we have a link to provide feedback. If you would like to suggest a topic for discussion, or if you would like to contribute a presentation on a topic of interest to you, let us know. Thanks again for joining us.